the role of the IMF, in which the United States would still hold a position even if it had been reformed. Thank you.
Thank you. Heribert?
Yeah, on the US puzzle, I think it is important to consider that in US foreign policy, you have what an American scholar characterized as 4 schools of thought. You always have them. You have Jeffersonian thinking, you have Jacksonian thinking, Hamiltonian thinking, and Wilsonian thinking. And they're all there all the time. What changes is the balance of power. Now at the moment, the Jacksonian thinking, which is the most inward-looking thinking, seems to dominate. That may change again. And the Wilsonians that emphasize the kind of utility of cooperation, and the Hamiltonians who emphasize the economic utility of cooperation, they are currently weak. This is how I could try to explain why Congress is reluctant to sign. On the question of conditionality, this is of course a wonderful topic which we could discuss well into dinner and tomorrow's lunch. What I would like to point out is that we haven't been looking at the alternatives that are out there, and we haven't done that in Europe, and I consider this to be a problem. We have a choice between conditionality and the provision of collateral in order to make sure that you get your money back. This is why you have conditionality. The Americans and the Mexicans did that in '95. The Mexicans pledged their future income from oil exports, and the Americans and the IMF did not tell the Mexicans what to do. And we could have done that in other financial crises, including Greece as well. We didn't do it, and I think this was a mistake, but for future crises, I think this is a topic that requires explanation. But lending without conditionality or collateral would be somewhat foolish. I don't recommend that.
Thank you very much. It's amazing how French can agree with the Germans so much. That's specific to the panel, I guess.
Thank you very much. So let me start with the China question, and I guess in some way it also goes to a bit the conditionality issue, which I think is underpinning your question. So let me not repeat what has been said, but the fact of the matter is, I think, especially with with the latest round of capital increases for the major financial institutions, you'll notice that the World Bank basically didn't feature there. The capital increase that the World Bank received was, or requested and therefore received was very, very small. So we are facing an issue where our financial capabilities are certainly not enough to fulfill the needs of many of our clients, and therefore we need to be selective and strategic in terms of how that's being used. But we also have to recognize that the needs of the clients are there, and they're larger than the financing envelope that we can bring to bear. So to that extent, the provision of additional finances by outside parties, be it China, be that somewhere else, is potentially a positive thing, right? You cannot say that the extra resources would not be a bad thing in and of themselves. Then you have to figure out in terms of how the resources are being put to use, etc. But that's a second order question. So in principle, the availability of resources there is a good thing because there are legitimate needs, and those needs countries ought to have at least opportunities to investigate how those needs are being met. So what that means for us then is, therefore, we need to be more strategic, more selective in terms of where we engage, where we think are the biggest payoffs in terms of our ability, and also providing policy advice, right? Which a lot of people in the bank would probably say is perhaps more valuable than the money itself, and that policy advice can reach across a number of areas, whether we provide financing there or not, right? And very, very quickly, it's a related comment on these issues of one World Bank group and all of that. I mean, the challenge was that it wasn't so clear, right, where one institution ended or where the other began. IFC is a lender, but IFC also provides advisory services, similarly the World Bank or IBRD provides advisory services, provides lending. So some more alignment in terms of what kind of advice is given, who are the clients, how we talk to them is needed on that. And again, many times because we don't have the financial capacity to meet all the needs, then maybe in some cases what's needed is a guarantee, some other kind of service. So the idea is to look across the spectrum of all the services that the World Bank Group provides and really make sure that what the client sees as one institution. The client doesn't need to think about whether they need to go here or there or there. What they see is one complete group of solutions.
Thank you. Professor Vermani?
Actually there are 5 issues which have been raised. So I'll go through it very quickly because I don't want to take all the time. First, on the relation between voting and borrowing capacity. This is a very important issue we raised in all the discussions. You can look at some of those papers I mentioned on the thing, because what has happened is that all this old stuff was applied to the developing countries. Once European countries started taking these loans, it went to 5 to, if I remember, 100 times the GDP. So the link was completely broken. And the argument still remained. The argument they were using against me and against us, including the BRICS, my friend here from Brazil, will probably not be aware of all the details, but was that there is this link, and that's just not true. So you are right about that. Second, on conditionality, let me give you a different perspective. The question I raised, what we raised, was not that there shouldn't be any conditionality. I always supported all the conditionality. What we said was that unless we have the power, the way the things are analyzed, the procedures, for example, capital flows, the way the IMF looked at capital flows was completely different. It took me 3 years, constant conflict, to change that policy, including again support from Brazil and others, on how you treat these sudden stops and squeezes. The standard position was it's all a macro problem. We said no, there is a macro prudential problem there which may need to be addressed in a different way. It took 3 years, okay? So that's the issue. It's not conditionality. It is what kind of things will work in a developing countries and what we need to do. That's the issue. And that will not change unless you have the power. That was our argument. Third, on China and the lender, frankly, I don't agree. I don't think I agree with the earlier questions, and I don't agree with you because I represented Sri Lanka. I was the one who was responsible for getting that loan, along with the loan for Bangladesh. So I don't think, as of now, China has an influence. The people who supported me was not, in any significant effect China, okay? I am the one who dealt with it, okay? I had to do all the arguments. So, the other element of this is that certainly our argument really was, you're giving all these loans to Europe and giving 10 times the GDP. Why are you being so stingy with my countries? I mean, both were my countries. I represented them, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Okay. Fourth, US Congress, very briefly, I think I agree with Mr. Dieter broadly, but the issue is really, it's not even of money actually, because there will be an offset, which Mr. Richardson pointed out. So there is no extra money. What the administration is afraid of, this is just my political analysis because I happen to be there, otherwise I wouldn't know. But what the administration is afraid of is that many Republicans of the Jackson School lump all UN agencies together. They don't make a distinction between IMF, World Bank, UN, and they want to cut funding for the UN. So they are afraid that instead of paying the arrears for the UN, which are huge, they will actually cut that in this process, because there's no simple way to just do that, okay? So that's the political economy of the US as far as I've understood it. And finally, on credibility, that's a very, very important issue. The paper, the note I mentioned in VOX-EU, that was the title of that. I said it's not just a matter of quotas and governance, it's a matter of credibility of the IMF. And unfortunately, in my view, they've lost a huge amount of credibility, because many of us were unsatisfied even with the 2010 reform. Brazil was relatively satisfied. But so we expected this 2014, 2015, which is completely dead as far as I can make out here, which again, Mr. Richardson mentioned. So, for those of us who have followed this very closely, the IMF's credibility has gone down, and maybe that's why there are already moves to cut the IMF back to what it was 5 years ago. I was very lucky. The period I was there, the 3 years, was probably the most active period in IMF history of the last 20 years or so. But anyway, so I enjoyed my stay there. I had a great time working in the IMF.
Thank you.
Great. I have the penultimate word, which I appreciate. I'm going to be brief. To respond to Premchandra's question about China, frankly, you know, we've gone through various phases of effectively competition from other, competition from other sources of financing, including private markets, right? There was a whole period in the first part of the last decade where basically nobody borrowed from the IMF. Everybody was borrowing from, issuing Eurobonds and not borrowing from the IMF. And frankly, that's probably a good thing, right? So the more development financing there is, the better. What I would also say is that, at least based on my experience in some African countries, is that Chinese lenders have become a lot more open to discussing with us and with the World Bank and others, and making more transparent the conditions and the background to their loans. So I think, from that perspective, China's evolution as a source of financing is generally positive. That's based on my experience. I'm not going to answer Rajat's question about U.S. politics, although I'm the only American on the panel. I don't have a clue. I mean, I don't have a deep historical analysis, and maybe that's because, I'm too close to it. So I'm not even going to go there. I will, though, try and come back to Jaimini's question, to tell us what we really think. I mean, I do think quota matters. Actually, I'll tell you why I think it matters. The quota governs the voting shares at the board, and they hire my boss, who then they hire the ultimate boss, and then who hires my boss, who then determines whether I get promoted or not. So it does matter. I mean, I think it's not just, so from that perspective, it's important who's addressing or managing the IMF. It's also important, I think, from a legitimacy, visibility standpoint. I mean, I think it would have, had Ngozi been the managing director of the IMF instead of Christine Lagarde, who I think is, by the way, has done quite a good job. That's my personal view. No, but it's true. But I think the bailouts in Europe would have had more legitimacy, right? And I think that's important. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot to be said for quota reform to address those issues. And I hope we go much further than the 14th quota reform suggests. So that, I think I'll stop on that point and turn it over to Pierre.
Thank you very much. I won't try to summarize this very rich debate, but let me leave you with two ideas for further thought. One ties together what Professor Vermani said and the debate on the US Congress. He said something about losing sovereignty. And in a world of globalization and interdependence, I would argue that we too readily make a confusion between losing sovereignty and sharing sovereignty. And sharing sovereignty with vision allows us to increase the effectiveness of the part of sovereignty that remains. And that we have discovered in Europe through many, many difficult crises. And even though we have discovered it, most of the politicians seem to be unaware of it and still look at the issue as losing sovereignty. And I think that's something that that prevents cooperation worldwide. The understanding that in a world that is globalized with interrelation and interdependence, you just can't assume that your sovereignty is going to be effective. And you need to share it if you want to restore power. And that's something that I think deserves a bit more research and discussion. The second thing is that Heribert was a bit pessimistic in his conclusion about the state of the world, and I would argue that there are different ways to look at it. There are two sets of issues that were discussed. One is what Heribert told us about the state of the world economy, of interdependence, of the difficulty of cooperate, the difficulty of collective action, the crisis at the WTO, the crisis at the IMF, the change everlasting at the World Bank, and so on. You could add and see and have a very, very grave view of what's happened. And then the second thing that we discussed is that at each individual institutional level, things are happening. So institutions are still working, they still adapt, the EU still exists, the Eurozone still exists, the WTO still exists, the World Bank still exists and is moving, the IMF as well and is doing a lot of things. So in a way, things work. But they work muddling through. And maybe it's a fact of life. Maybe what we are doing at the world level is what happened at the level of nation states, creating ever more complex structure. In any nation state, you don't have one single World Bank or one single IMF. You have thousands, sometimes millions of banks And that works, right? And maybe what we are creating at the world level is going to resemble that, with several multilateral institutions and a host of regional institutions, and the fact that some of these regional institutions at some point will have to deal with externalities that are not regional but global, so they will have to turn to global institutions to address them, and that will be murky. And not simple, and you won't be able to show that on a single chart, but maybe this is a world we are creating. And if that's the case, I think it turns pessimism on its head, and what we have to do is to understand complexity, right? So let me end with this more positive view, and I hope that that's right, and thank you very much thank the panelists for very interesting remarks, and all of you for your participation. Thank you.
I would request all of you to please be seated, because we'll just go to the closing remarks by Lise Grande, the UNDP resident representative. So I would request you to please be seated. Panelists can. This will take. These are the kind of the concluding remarks for this conference, and we're delighted to have the UNDP resident representative, Lise Grande, with us to make the concluding remarks for this conference. Thank you, Lise.
Thank you. And I'll keep my comments brief. In thinking about global reform, the United Nations is the biggest club in the world for the world's countries. There are 193 members of the United Nations plus occupied Palestine. We also include within the same framework the world's coziest and smallest and arguably most important club, the P5, permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So when the UN talks about reform of global institutions and global governance, we literally span the spectrum from how do you reform the most representative possible arrangement, all the way through to how do you reform a club of permanent 5 members of the Security Council who are able to invoke and deploy an army. I noted the comment that was made by one of the panelists who said, oh my gosh, the UN, you can't get anything done. There are so many members of you. And I was thinking back to the period of World War II when a very famous global leader said, yeah, well, how many divisions can be deployed? And of course, this is the point about the UN. We can deploy divisions. What I'd like to do in my comments is just to go over one more time why the UN thinks reform is so important, and then to talk about how the UN has tried to reform, and then to give you some very anodyne reflections. Those will be the really official part of my comments on what the UN thinks reform should look like. Okay, so why is the UN so concerned about reform? The first point is obvious. It's because there is a steady but utterly unmistakable change in the balance of global power, rather than 2 global superpowers or 1 global superpower supported by a bevy of countries that used to be powerful, of course the former colonial powers. We now have the emergence of regional superpowers and regional powers, and I want to take that point for a minute, because it's not just that we're talking about a multipolar world. That would, in fact, would be easier to deal with. We're talking about a world where you have regional superpowers, big expectations, big capabilities, and regional powers. And it's the management of that relationship. Let me say this again. It's the management of that relationship which is the most unpredictable and presents the greatest risks to global security and stability. There's another point, of course, that the UN recognizes, which is that countries which were second tier only a few years ago are not so any longer, and they expect the world not only to take notice, but to change the rules of the game so that they can take their rightful place. Problem with this is that the countries which were second tier do not speak with a unified voice. Makes it very hard for us all to know what we're supposed to do to change, because there's not a consistent position on this. One of the advantages of the club is that they're consistent in what they say. Of course, they do so from a position of great influence and power. We recognize that. But the fact that the second-tier countries which are emerging up do not have a unified agenda makes it very complicated for the organs of the UN to respond in ways which meet their expectations. The rise of the emerging economies, of course, is of particular significance, and the evidence of the shift in global power is clear. Believe me, all major institutions in the UN are studying what this means. But from the UN's perspective, we have to keep making this point. It's not just about the emerging economic weight of certain powers. What really seizes the UN is the way in which certain emerging powers, not just economically strong ones, but regional powers, are trying to assert their role and the steps they are prepared to take to assert that role. There are other reasons, of course, that reform are needed. Current institutional and governance arrangements have failed to deal with inequality. Very interesting that of all the points that were made in the last panel, that point didn't come up. Yet if you look at the debates within the UN on global governance reform and you look at which reasons are cited, inequality is the #1 reason. The world is more unequal today, we all know that, than at any point since World War II. In fact, a significant majority of the world's population lives in societies now that are more unequal than they were 20 years ago when the tracking for the MDG goals actually started. As we all know, Oxfam keeps reminding us of this, the world's 85, this is just shocking, 85 richest people have more money and resources than the poorest 50% of the world population. UNDP's just released a study where it points out that in the last 2 decades alone, income inequality has increased by 11% in developing countries, with more than 75% of the population in the world today living in societies where income is more unequally distributed than it was when the Cold War ended. And the great promise, of course, at the end of the Cold War was that prosperity was going to be shared. And obviously that hasn't happened. And for the UN, this is one of the major reasons why reform of global institutions is so critical. There's a third reason that the UN is committed to reform. We think that global institutions are struggling to deal with the following problems: the escalation of violence, social upheavals, infectious diseases, and environmental destruction. So our institutions can't deal with violence, social upheavals, infectious diseases, and environmental destruction. It's not at all clear, and of course the mess in Syria certainly points to this, that global security institutions like the UN Security Council are going to be able to meet the expectations of the world to ensure regional peace and security and to protect human welfare. It's also not clear whether global institutions can deal with the kind of financial crises we've been experiencing as capitalism marches through its inevitable waves of recession and depression. Although many in the financial world applaud, and rightly, the role that global institutions have played recently in helping to deal with the global financial crisis, in the United Nations, I may say that there are very few who doubt that more could or should have been done to mitigate the impact of the crisis on the world's poorest. Look, if you come out of a crisis and the world's richest people are better off and the world's poorest people are in a more precarious position, I mean, I think we would all conclude that we haven't done the best that we can. The fourth reason is obvious. We live in an era of unprecedented globalization and interdependence where global public goods cannot be secured or protected by any one nation alone. It's on that last point that I would just like to emphasize the following. The UN is busier now than we've literally ever been in our entire history. There's more demand for multilateralism to address a deeper and more complex set of problems than we've ever been asked to do before. If you look at what the UN was doing even in 1990 at the end of the Cold War to the type of work that we are expected to do now, we absolutely cannot keep up. Of course, what this points to is that this very complex world that we're living in with all kinds of interdependencies and regional superpowers and regional powers and all of this requires a level of sophisticated coordination that the UN system has not been able to deliver on. And this is exactly why we think that reform has to happen now. Now, in preparing for this speech, we did something very interesting. We actually looked at how the UN has tried to reform itself. And I have to say, admittedly, we've done a better job in reform than I guessed before I started to prepare the speech. So the UN, kind of surprisingly, has reformed itself several times. UNDP itself, the organization that I head here in India, was itself a product of the period of decolonization. Newly independent countries in the 1960s said, we don't like the way the UN is organized, and we expect to have a development organization that looks after us in a way that we trust. UNDP was born, therefore, in 1965. The establishment of UN Women, the UN's newest agency. There are actually 41 separate agencies that make up the United Nations. UN Women is the newest one. Was a reform that was made in response to the demands of countries to give much higher priority to women's equality. The adoption of what's called the transformative agenda in 2011 radically changed the way that the United Nations delivers humanitarian assistance. That was a reform that was made in response to the massive and complex nature of today's humanitarian and rescue operations. You may be aware that the United Nations right now in 20 countries is providing food and sustenance to at least half of their populations. Again, something that was absolutely unthinkable during the Cold War period. Interestingly as well, at a Heads of State Summit in 2005, UN member states agreed to all kinds of reforms. So 10 years ago, the Human Rights Council was born. The Peace Building Commission was established. The entire Secretariat of the UN was overhauled and modernized. An ethics office was established. And a quite sensible plan for enlarging the Security Council was tabled, although not yet accepted. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Council, because if you want to talk about an issue which is highly sensitive to a country's sense of sovereignty, it would be human rights. And yet the UN, against astonishing odds, actually managed to reform itself on this question, and in a way which is wholly progressive. Before the 2005 reforms, human rights were dealt with through the Human Rights Commission. When the Council was formed, every single country in the world, including the United States, agreed to a universal periodic review. That means that countries present their record on human rights to every other country and discuss and debate it. And the UN managed to agree to do that to itself. The commitment to reform continues in the UN. Our current Secretary General has appointed a change management team that's working to increase accountability and improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization. As a long-serving bureaucrat, I hope you will allow me to say that it would be good if this team hurried up its work. As to what the UN would like to suggest are sensible ways of approaching reform. These are official statements. So when the UN officially talks about what it expects, I have to step back a moment and just like we did with the IMF, do a mea culpa. The United Nations has a bureaucracy and it has member states. When we say the UN, of course, what we are really referring to is the view of the member states. As a serving bureaucrat, we reflect those views. So when I say the UN thinks that this is what should happen, what I am sharing with you is the consensus coming out of that unmanageable thing called the General Assembly, what they think reform at a minimum should take into account. It is as follows. Firstly, that global institutions have to be more efficient and effective. Now, the really important word here that's missing is representative. Okay, so the institutions have to be more efficient and effective. Why? Because they have to take coordinated action to deal with climate change, peace, security, inequality, and economic volatility. There is a very clear recognition that if you want to move in a coordinated fashion quickly, you have to do so because you're efficient and effective, not necessarily because you're representative. Secondly, the UN hopes that reforms make global institutions more legitimate and transparent, so that they function in a way which reflects geopolitical realities. Reflecting geopolitical realities, again, I've got to be really clear here about the distinction that we make between countries which say and demand we're important, we belong, listen to us, and countries which contribute to multilateralism in a way which is recognized by every other country. Huge difference between the two. Countries that stomp their feet and say, we're important, pay attention to us, are not necessarily embraced and recognized for their role by other countries. They are recognized for their role if they